Have a seat. It's so good to have you here, friends. My name is Chris, and I get to serve as the pastor here at Third Coast Church, and I love getting to do that, and I love it when we have Sundays like today where we get to celebrate something special together like Father's Day. That's a really great thing. If this is one of your first times to Third Coast, especially, I'm glad that you're here, and I'd love to meet you. If we haven't met yet, I'd love to say hey and connect with you out in the lobby afterwards, just get to know your name. Always love to see all of the new faces who come to Third Coast week after week. And if you came last week and it was a different guy preaching and that was your first time here, that was Jordan, our youth minister, who did a great job. He's not here today, so please don't clap for him because he wouldn't hear it, nor do I want his ego to be stroked in that way, all right? No, Jordan did an amazing job. He really did. It's so fun to see him grow in his confidence. And I want to tell you the reason that I wasn't here last week is that Aaron and I, we're actually on a marriage retreat. We've been married for 21 and a half years about, and we went on the first ever, it's all right, no, this is the first time we ever went on a marriage retreat. Not because things are on the rocks, we just thought, you know what, we ought to give that a try, right? See if things could be even better. We had a blast, and it's something that I'm looking forward to in the next few months, being able to offer to more and more of you married couples through Third Coast Church, the weekend to remember. It's a great time, and one of the components of the weekend is a date night on Saturday night. There's no sessions. You just get to go out and do whatever you want to. And so we went and took a cooking class at a Sur La Table in Houston. And that's that middle, or the picture on the end. You can see we made steak. And one of the things that we did is we made homemade pasta. Have you ever made homemade pasta before? Like, it's really not that hard. Like, it's just flour and eggs, and you kind of mix it up and you knead it for a while, and then you got to let it sit for a little bit, and then you come back and do some more stuff to it. And then you just have to roll it out, like forever. It's got this process to it, and then you cut it, and eventually you then have to let it sit, and then you boil it, and then at that point, then you have pasta. It's incredible, right? And we learned some things on the retreat. First, marriage, totally worth it. It's fantastic. Love being married. I'd highly recommend it. Homemade pasta, not so much, right? Like, it's... And I mean, it was fun. It's a great experience. Like, if you just are looking for something to do for a while, homemade pasta is a fun way to pass the time. It's kind of interesting that you can take these ingredients and throw them together and there's pasta. But if you just want pasta, it is a terrible way to get to pasta. You could drive to H-E-B, you could buy dried pasta, you could come home, boil it in less time than it would take you to make homemade pasta. It's a terrible process, so inefficient, and I can't even say that it's 1,000 times better. Like, it's still pasta. At the end of the day, it's going to have a sauce on it, right? But so marriage worth it, pasta, I'm not so sure. Today, we are going to be in Hebrews chapter 12. And one of the things that is kind of key about this passage is going to talk a lot about discipline. And we love the things that result from discipline. Every area in your life where you have shown some discipline, where you've grown in discipline, we love the results of those things, right? The way that you have matured, maybe the way that your character has grown, maybe even areas of wisdom. We love the end results. But sometimes it feels a little bit like making homemade pasta. Like, I don't want to have to do all the work that it takes to get there. I don't love the discipline side of things. Like, is there any way that I could just shortcut the process and just get to character and wisdom and maturity without having to do the discipline side of things? That would be better, right? What is the dried pasta equivalent of discipline? How do I arrive at that? That's what we're going to be talking about today, is why discipline is so important in our lives. But if we were taking a poll in here, discipline is not one of those words that we love. And I don't even just mean personally, I mean as a culture. Discipline doesn't always have the most favorable ratings in our life. And there's good reasons for that. Sometimes what we're reacting to is those who are over disciplinarians, right? They show too much discipline. And so there are some forms of discipline that have gotten a really bad rap. We don't like it. And so even things like spankings are complicated. They weren't complicated when I was a kid, I promise. promise you that. But they are more complicated now. And I get that. We don't necessarily want kids to grow up thinking that the person who is in charge is just the one who can hit the hardest, right? Like that's not what we would ever want children to know. And so sometimes discipline is like not thought of favorably because it's just equated with these other, forms of punishment. But at the same time, all of us in here know the result of no discipline, especially like in a child's life. When you are around a kid and you could tell that they've just never been told no ever in their life, we know that that's difficult and not going to result in a well-rounded child. And so whether it's a spoiled child or maybe even worse, an ignored child, it's not just that they aren't disciplined, it's that it's almost like their parents don't care. They don't even want to spend the time and the effort and the energy. We know that that is wrong. And so discipline is complicated. It's not one of those things that we just feel so favorably about, and yet we know that it is beneficial. Well, one of the reasons why I think, again, discipline is not something that we love is because we confuse it with some other things. And so as we talk about discipline today, I want to be clear. Discipline is not punishment. Discipline is not punishment. Now, they do have some similarities, and sometimes discipline and punishment go together. But discipline is not punishment. Let's use like an SAT way of describing this. Discipline is not punishment in the same way that pepperonis are not a pizza, right? Pepperonis can sometimes be a part of a pizza, but if you eat a pepperoni all by itself, that's not the same thing as eating a pizza. You don't have the whole comprehension of what a pizza is. Punishment is sometimes part of discipline. Sometimes there are consequences, and we do suffer some for our choices, but that's not the same thing as discipline. That doesn't fully comprise discipline, but sometimes we think they're the same, and that might be one of the reasons why we react negatively to it. Discipline is also not control. So in some people's minds, the only reason you would impose discipline is all about control. I just want you to do exactly what I want. But actually, good discipline is more about guiding. And this is one of the hardest things, especially as a parent, is to watch your kids knowing that they are going to fail at something and then letting them do it anyway. Man, that is tough. Like, it'd be so much easier just to control their life and say, don't do that. I'm not going to let you do that. And in some areas, absolutely, you have to do that. But discipline is ultimately about guiding and teaching. And so discipline and control are not the same things. Discipline is also not anger, which for many of us, those two things might be synonymous because it felt like we were punished or we were disciplined when the other person was angry. But anger is an emotional response to something, whereas discipline ought to be measured. It ought to be intentional. And lastly, discipline is not rejection. Maybe that's what we experience when we think about discipline. As somebody who is correcting me, it feels like they are rejecting me. Discipline couldn't be further from that. In fact, discipline is the statement that you are worth it. That my time spent on you, like I think this mistake, I think this situation can actually be redeemed, that you are worth taking the time on. It is the opposite of being rejected. Discipline is not rejection. But if all of those things are how you think about discipline, then perhaps today we might be able to give you a new picture of what discipline is. And this is what discipline is. It is training. Discipline is training. And we know that when we think about working out or any other athletic pursuit, or maybe if you're learning to play an instrument and you're trying to create the discipline of practicing the piano every day, or even the spiritual disciplines, discipline is training. And what we're going to read in the book of Hebrews today, in Hebrews chapter 12, that's what the word means. It means to be trained. It's only used a couple of other times in the New Testament, and in each circumstance, it always has this idea of training. And so maybe that idea of discipline is new to you. Maybe you've got all of these other negative pictures, even to the point when you see the word, you just think bad thoughts. And perhaps today, you might set those aside for just a moment and consider what it might be like to think of discipline as training. And so let's read Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to start in verse 4, and then we are going to read down to verse 17. And we only have a little bit left in Hebrews. By the way, if you've been with us, this is the 20th week we have been in Hebrews. We've got 2 more, and then we will be done, and we will never read Hebrews again at Third Coast Church. That's it. We've completed that book. We're done with it. Put it on the shelf. There's a lot of other ones that we can study. We'll never come back to this one ever never, ever again. Not really. We'll come back to it when we need to. But let's go ahead and read. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 4. It says this, "In your struggle against sin, have you not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood? And have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had our earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Therefore, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears." This is the word of God for the people of God. I love it sometimes how through no specific planning of our own, it just is, it works out that on Father's Day today, this is the passage that was naturally there in our outline. It's so good to see that. It's just one of those fun reminders of God going ahead of us and being bigger than all of our plans. But today, we're talking about dads, we're talking about discipline, and we begin this passage. The author quotes from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 3, actually, is that quotation there in verses 5 and 6 about how we are to regard discipline. And then the author begins to explain, here is why discipline is actually a good thing in your life. And the first thing that he says is discipline is how we know we are really God's children. Discipline is how we can be sure and be confident that we're really God's children. Now, I would pick a different way, right? That's not the way that I would choose things. I would just like God, could you not do something to me? Could you not make me tall and handsome? Could I not have a tan that lasts all year, even when it's cloudy outside? Those would be other ways that you could identify me as God's child. But no, the author says actually the way that we know we are God's children is that from time to time we experience discipline. I wouldn't pick that, but I understand it from my own earthly perspective. And even as we look throughout the rest of the Bible, if we think back a long time ago when we were talking about Abraham and the importance of Abraham having a son, we know that the importance of family members, people who could carry on the family name and the legacy, dads would be so invested in their children to raise them up right, that actually the time and the investment they spent on them, that was a way that you would understand this is actually my son. There's all sorts of ancient writings from different philosophers and people outside of the Bible that talked about no, that's an illegitimate child. That's not actually my son. Therefore, he will not receive my discipline. He won't share in my fortune. All those kinds of things. Because the idea was, listen, if you're not really my kid, I don't care about you. I'm not going to spend the time disciplining you and trying to instruct you and train you up. And if that seems harsh, I promise we do the same thing every single time we go to the grocery store, because you have all seen this kid at some point, right? They're there and their mom or their dad is having a terrible time. They're I'm going to count to 3 and then you're going to get up. 1, 2, okay, I'm going to count to 5 and you're at 3, 4, okay, I'm going to count to 10 and you're just come on, man, at 3, just leave them, right? You'll have other kids, they're fine. I've seen giraffes in the wilderness, they get up and walk at that point. This is what happens, just leave that kid be. And you want to come alongside and you want to give some discipline, and then you realize that's not my child. This is how I go to jail, right? Like if I step into this moment, it's not my kid. I don't discipline them, right? But if it was my kid, I might handle it a little bit differently. And this isn't to judge parents. I mean, we all have our moments, right? I've had the days where it is tough and then the kid is throwing a fit and you're like, I just don't have it in me. Every parent has that day. But all of us in here understand the reason why we don't walk up to every child that we see and start to train them and instruct them. Because they're not our child. Right? We only discipline our children. We only step in and provide that guiding when we are the ones that are being called on to discipline. I don't discipline random kids. You don't discipline random kids, because discipline is how you prove legitimacy. You discipline your children. And if you're in here today and you don't have kids and you're like, I don't quite understand that. I've never felt that kind of picture. I've never felt that need to discipline another kid. Perhaps you have played on a sports team at some point, right? And maybe while you were playing, you had a coach who was just barking in your ear all the time, yelling at you, hey, why are you there? You should be over here. That's the wrong position. Like, I would frequently get yelled at by my soccer coach all the time. Like, did you buy a ticket? Are you a spectator? What do you do? And get in the action, right? Always his favorite thing. I was like, I didn't buy a ticket, coach. I'm trying, I'm running, doing my best thing. And I remember somebody telling me that it's when the coach stops talking to you that's when you're in trouble. You might feel like, oh man, that coach is constantly yelling at me. But somebody told me early in life, hey, it's when the coach stops talking to you, that's when you're in trouble. Because when the coach stops talking to you, that's when he doesn't really think you're worth the training and instruction anymore. You're never going to reach that point where you're perfect, that you have no more instruction. But if they're not talking to you, that means that they don't really care that much about you on the team. See, discipline proves legitimacy. Discipline is how we know we are God's children. This is what the author says in verses 7 and 8. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? That doesn't mean we have to like discipline. In fact, he says there in verse 8, the discipline is something that we endure. You never describe things you love as endure. Like, man, eating that cheesecake, I had to endure that, right? You know, I loved it. I savored it. Things that we don't like are things that we endure. But discipline can be endured because it is a reminder of God's love for us, that he cares for us, that he wants to guide us and instruct us. And the second thing this author tells us and why we can endure discipline is because the end result is worth the discipline. He uses an argument here that's kind of lesser to greater, something that we've experienced that then can point us back to God. And the author says, didn't we respect our parents for their discipline? Didn't we respect our parents for their discipline? I bet that your parents had some rules that you didn't have to do at other friends' house, right? And at some point you might have even told your parents that. Man, I just love going to Josh's house because Josh's mom lets us stay up late, right? Josh's mom never tells us we have to go to bed. Josh's mom lets us drink sodas for breakfast. Josh's mom lets us play video games all night. And your parents are probably thinking that's because Josh's mom doesn't love him, right? They're thinking something like that, there's some situation, but all of us in here had some rule. My parents made me pay for everything and my friends just got everything given to them, right? My parents made me get a job and my friends never had to work. Your parents likely had some set of rules that your other friends didn't have to obey. And it's later in life, as you begin to grow up and you get a little bit older, that you look back and you think, those rules maybe weren't as terrible as I thought they were at the moment. I didn't like them at the moment. Kind of hated them. In fact, we probably all feel a little bit like what Mark Twain says, right? When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years. I don't know if your dad was that same way, but they just get so smart during those times. As we grow up, we begin to realize maybe those things weren't all so bad. And maybe even on the times that they were bad, they were still trying to do their best given the limited perspective that they had. And if we can understand that, the picture we got from our earthly fathers, the author says, how much more can we understand God's discipline? How much greater is it? Because if our limited earthly fathers, with their small perspective, doing the best that they can, try to discipline us and guide us, we have an eternal Father with unlimited perspective who loves you unconditionally, which means we can be confident that every bit of discipline we receive from God is for our good. That's what the author says here, that the discipline is for our good. It's not because God is bored, that he doesn't have anything else to do that day. No, the discipline that we receive, the guiding, the correction, the conviction in our life, that it is done for our good. You may be asking, how? What kind of good? It tells us right here two things that are for our good. First, in verse 10, that we can share, clicked it too early, that we can share in his holiness. That's what it says in verse 10, that we are disciplined so that we can share in his holiness. That is, that we can be holy like God. Every parent, you hope that your kids will one day grow up to love the things that you love. Like if you're a parent out there who gardens, if you take your kids out to the garden and you teach them all about what it's like to raise plants and harvest and do all those things, you will be so thrilled if later on when your kids are older that they also like to garden. Right? Maybe you're just a dad and your thing is every single week you just wash the car. And then you see later on as your kid grows up, you're like, man, they wash the car in the same way. Like they use the bucket just like I do. When your kids do the things that you loved, the ways that you did them, there's something about that is so meaningful. And the author of Hebrews tells us, listen, God disciplines us so that we will share in his holiness. That is, that we will grow up to be more like him. That we'll respond the way that he does, that we'll love the things that God loves. The discipline is for our good. But then also in verse 11 says that we're disciplined so that we can receive the peaceful fruit of righteousness. I don't know, man, I keep clicking. I don't know what I'm doing, y'all. Sorry, the peaceful fruit of righteousness. I don't know that I've ever described life that way or thought of as that, to be a life goal, but I love the way that is phrased. That my life would be experiencing the peaceful fruit of righteousness. That as I grow up to be more and more like God, that the peace in my life would increase. That righteousness would result in peace. That my life would have joy, that it would have meaning, that it would grow into fulfillment, this peaceful fruit of righteousness. The author says that's why we are disciplined. It's for our good, so that we can become more like God and that we can share in the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Finally, in verses 12, this is what it says, is that discipline strengthens us. I love how the author puts it, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees. That's also what we said when we were taking the picture at the Murph at the end of it, right? We're like, guys, lift up your drooping hands, strengthen those weak knees. We want to look strong for this picture. That's what the author says discipline does for us. It strengthens us. It helps us to carry on when we are at our weakest. And so the picture is one of the guide wires around a tree. That it is helping us grow in the right direction. That maybe the wind might toss us one way or the other, but that discipline holds us steady when our knees are weak. Strengthen your weak knees. Lift up your drooping hands. This is what discipline does for us in our life. Now, one quick aside before we wrap things up for today. There's this temptation, and there's actually this hard interpretive challenge here, because we might read all of these verses and then begin to say, oh, so every painful thing that I ever experienced in my life, you're telling me that is discipline. And let me be clear, that's not what I'm saying at all. There are some pains and challenges that we are going to experience that are not God's discipline. There are some things that happen, some evil in this world that is not God's discipline. Not every bit of pain is God's discipline. And we're going to actually talk more about that later on in July. We're going to start a sermon series on what to do with evil in the world. How do we make sense of evil in the world? Later in July, that'll be coming up. But for today, what we need to understand is that this author is writing to a specific set of people. This is a pastoral letter to a group of people. And we've seen throughout the book of Hebrews that these are people who are starting to feel a little weak, that they're starting to fall away because following Jesus has just gotten a little bit too hard. They are not confronting some incredible evil that has happened to them. They aren't trying to make sense of some incredible grief necessarily. These are just people who are wondering, is it worth the difficulty of following Jesus? And the author comes alongside of them and says, I know that you're experiencing some challenges, but those challenges are for your good. They're going to help you grow strong and to share in God's holiness. So as we close today, perhaps we can think in terms of how we can respond to discipline. And there's three things I want to leave you with as we prepare for our response time. First step is this, is that we can recognize discipline in our life. I'm afraid that too often there are moments where discipline is showing up and I don't even think about it being God's way of correcting me and guiding me, right? I just think, man, this is just another dumb thing that happens in my life, right? I don't even pause to think, wait, maybe this is God correcting me and instructing me and training me. And whether that's a circumstance or a word from somebody else, or maybe when I read something in Scripture, first step that all of us ought to be doing is we ought to be thinking, is this perhaps a moment where God is teaching me? How can I recognize God's discipline? Of course, one of the ways that all of us can do that is we can grow to know his voice better and better as he speaks to us. And the way that we do that, it's real mind-blowing stuff. Reading our Bible, praying, worshiping, participating in the community of his believers, all of those things, that is how we grow to know his voice, and that's how we become more accustomed to recognizing discipline in our life. Second thing we can do, if we recognize, then the second thing is we can receive it as God's love. Perhaps that's where some of y'all are caught right now, is in that moment, like, I understand that God is instructing me, I'm just mad about it. I don't want to do it, right? I don't like that. I don't want God to treat me that way. And instead of being frustrated and angry, perhaps we can loosen up our fists just a little bit and say, God, I'm going to receive this as your love. I'm going to understand that you're doing this for my good, that I can share in your holiness. I don't like it. It's unpleasant, but I think I can endure it because it is for my good. God, I recognize this as discipline, and I receive it as a sign of your love. And then lastly, I'm going to respond with obedience. You see, it's not enough to just recognize it as discipline, like, oh, God's trying to correct me. It's not enough to just receive that, man, and I understand that he's doing that because he loves me. And then to end there, no, we have to complete the loop. We have to actually then respond with obedience. If we're feeling ourselves being impatient all the time and then circumstances keep coming up that are putting that like right in front of us where, man, I can never demonstrate patience. Okay, that's recognizing it as God's discipline. And perhaps we can even say, God, I understand that's an area that I need to work on. But if I never work on patience, if I never try and put that into practice and say, God, I am going to be more patient because that's who you're training me to be, we haven't finished things. We have to respond with obedience. So discipline is done for our good. And the thing that we can do is we can recognize it, we can receive it, and we can respond to it. Eric's going to come up and he's going to play a song, and we're going to be able to respond by singing today. But I want to invite all of y'all, perhaps one of those things is the response that you need today. Maybe there have been some circumstances, and it's only in these last few moments that you're like, wait a second, God might actually have been speaking to me through that. That actually perhaps like God has been training me and instructing me, and it's like he's putting those kind of wires around me like I'm a tree, and he's just trying to help me like grow straight in my life and to grow strong and true. Maybe today is a moment of recognition. And you can pray and thank God for that. Maybe some of us are in that spot where we know it's discipline. We're just mad as can be about it. And today we can open up ourselves a bit to saying, God, I will receive this as love. I don't enjoy it, but God, I know that it is a sign of your love for me. And then finally, maybe for some of us, it's just taking that step of obedience and actually trying to respond. God, I know you've been calling me to be more peaceful. I know you've been calling me to be more loving. I know you've been calling me to be more graceful, to forgive somebody. That's really hard. I don't want to do it. But God, I'm going to respond because I think that's what you are training me to do. I think that's how I can become more like you. Recognize, receive, and respond. I'm going to pray in just a moment, and then I'll be down front. If there's anything I could pray with you about today, any of these things, or maybe just something else that's on your heart, I'd love to take this opportunity to do that with you. And so I'm going to ask that you'd stand at this time. I'm going to pray for us, and then we will sing together with Eric for a few moments. God, it's difficult to say thank you for discipline. I hope that one day I can get to that point, much like my own dad, in thinking about the rules and the circumstances in my life where I can look back and say thank you. But God, in the moment, it's so hard to say thank you. And yet we know that the discipline that you provide in our lives, the training, the instruction, the guiding, it is for our good so that we can become more like you. And so today, God, may we receive that instruction with love, and may we respond with obedience. God, soften all of our hearts to be shaped and molded to be more like you. And we ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. If you'd like to come forward and pray, this is the moment. Otherwise, let's sing together with Eric.
Look at the flowers.